There are two stories senior leaders tell themselves about Gen Z. The first is that they're lazy, entitled, uncommitted, they don't really want to put in the work. And the second is that they're tech natives, that they'll figure the rest out on their own. Both of these are wrong, and the cost is showing up in your retention numbers, hiring pipeline, and the talent you somehow can't seem to keep. I'm Kim Bohr, CEO of Spark Effect and host of Courage to Advance. My guest today is Ashlynne Valdez. Ashlynne is an HR professional, the founder of SoundHR, the president of DisruptHR Las Vegas, the founder of People and Profits Association, and most importantly, she's a Gen Z professional, which means she's sitting in a seat almost nobody else in the conversation is sitting in. Inside the generation and inside the function where senior leaders' assumptions about the generation actually meet payroll. We're going to get into what leaders are misreading and what this generation actually brings that can be leveraged. We have a lot to cover, so let's dive in.
Thanks so much for having me today, Kim.
I'm so excited to be speaking with you. You're Gen Z and you're a certified professional human resource practitioner. So I want you to talk a little bit about your experience before SoundHR. You'd spent 4 years working across HR and business development in a variety of industries. And I would love for you to speak to what did you see in those rooms that made you decide that the function wasn't actually built for the generation that's walking into it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say one thing that I really noticed is that a lot of companies kind of fail to set their employees up for success. And being a Gen Z employee, being somebody who has a lot of drive to, do different things in my careers, I found that I still wanted that structure. I still wanted some level of accountability. And I found that so often you walk into an organization, whether that's been in my experience or, with some of my peers, where they're kind of just handed a computer and a desk, and it's kind of like, good luck, and you'll do great. And then you hear everybody talking about how Gen Z doesn't want to work, or, we're this difficult generation. And I kept on thinking, I don't think it's that we're difficult. I think we're entering this really unique work world that has changed drastically, even since I entered the workforce, 5 years ago. And it's not so much about not wanting to work, but it's about wanting to know why we're doing the work and what is the purpose and what is the outcome and what is expected of us beyond just showing up for our working hours. And then outside of that, how do we have a job where we know that we're achieving what we're set out to do or what we've set out to do, but we're also able to have a life outside of that, right? So I think it's really having those strong and strict parameters that we know we're doing the right thing when we're in our work, so that we could actually have a life outside of, our 9 to 5.
So did you have a specific moment that you could think of where you moved from kind of this is frustrating to really like this is broken and I want to see something different? Was there a specific example that you kind of flashed in your head?
Yeah, I remember in the last role I had before starting my company, I felt like my skills were so underutilized. I felt like I have all of these ideas and I have all of these, things that I think I can do, but I don't have any set of deliverables. I don't have any KPIs. And I kept on asking myself, like, is it me? Am I failing? Am I doing this? And then I came to this realization of, you can be the most ambitious, creative, excited person, but if you don't have that, helpful guideline or, these helpful KPIs, this helpful training to really help you achieve that, you're never going to be successful. And so I really came to that realization point of it can't just be me. There has to be other individuals. And the interesting thing, that I found is that I talk about these Gen Z issues, but it's not just Gen Z that cares. Right. I can talk with anybody that I meet and say, have you had this experience of feeling like you were set up for failure or like you weren't really given the right opportunities? But if you would have been given those tools, you would have exploded. And pretty much everyone I talk to, has had that experience. And so I realized, okay, if I can't enter companies and get that, I want to be able to create that for companies and really create the type of work environments that I would want to work in.
One of the things you've got with your tagline that I just absolutely love that really showcases your different way of thinking is, so your tagline's not your mama's HR. And obviously you're really putting a strong stake in the ground. So what does that urgency come from in how you're wanting to be more disruptive in that way?
Yeah. So It's funny. I created that tagline with a friend of mine. My mom is an HR director. Her mom is also an HR director. And so we kind of came, we've been raised hearing from our mamas about, working in HR. And that tagline really came from this idea that HR has been seen and acted as such a tactical function within an organization as opposed to a strategic function. And so I really like the idea of saying, this is not your mama's HR. This is not the HR, that's growing into the, LinkedIn ecosphere and what we're doing with DisruptHR and with different organizations. I really wanted to show that HR can be very strategic. They are set there to help the employees, not to just help the business. And kind of create that disruptive idea that, HR is such an important function in the business that I think often gets missed and often has been dismissed as, oh, that's just HR. We don't want to talk to HR. HR is just there to protect the business, and it's kind of evolving into this new wave of HR leaders and professionals.
Well, and it feels like with your generation, there's a lot of differences that need to be considered. There's things that you all are looking for. So one of the things that comes to mind, if we think about, let's just start off from the stereotype perspective, but I want to add in some thinking I've been doing around from even my sons, because my son's also Gen Z at 20. So some of the more common things I've heard senior leaders say about Gen Z is that they're lazy, they're entitled, they're uncommitted, which I, disagree with. However, that is out there. And so from where you sit, what do you feel like people are actually seeing? Or do you feel like these are the same things that have been said about every generation that comes into the workforce?
Yeah, I definitely think this is something that's been said about every generation that's entered the workforce. One of the unique things about Gen Z, of course, is that we have social media. So before, people might complain, but it wasn't as prominent. There weren't people who are going viral on TikTok or Instagram talking about their experience in their workforce. Whereas now we can collectively say, hey, I don't think this is right, and let's do something about it. And I think that oftentimes don't get me wrong, I think there are certainly extremists, like anything, who could be defined as lazy or entitled. But I think most of the time it's really just setting boundaries. And for some reason that gets labeled as difficult, lazy, entitled. The other unique thing about Gen Z is that we're entering the workforce in really, really strange times. Like I entered the workforce during COVID. I graduated college. And with my graduation, I could only have like 3 or 4 people attend, and I know that some of the younger Gen Z graduated high school, or, we had all of these weird experiences during what's supposed to be formative years. And then we enter the workforce and we can't afford to buy homes. Gas prices are skyrocketing, grocery prices are skyrocketing. And so I think we all kind of look around at our work and we say, why would I give my employer 110% if I can barely afford to live? Where is that fair trade-off? And so I think some of that nuance is often missed of, oh, Gen Z just doesn't work, but there's not really that understanding of we're coming into this world that is not the dream that we were sold growing up.
Yeah. Well, I think that's such an important point. I had in season 1 of our podcast, I spoke with a researcher who was doing research on Gen Z. And so those things that you just said were really critical and we've seen a lot of data since then. Gen Z isn't likely to be able to buy a home easily anytime soon. The reality of that work-life balance, that they do want to have some of that because there's all the things that were supposed to be guarantees that we're told, like, if you do X, you're going to get Y, really aren't panning out. So as an HR professional, what do you think some organizations maybe could do, maybe policy-wise or things like that, to help Gen Z maybe get more knowledge in areas? Or is there stuff there that you think that there's also been missing from your HR lens?
I think from my HR lens, and I talked about this in one of my Disrupt HR presentations, is really having key deliverables for your role. So I think, again, that work-life balance idea is great, but as an employee, I need to know what would make me successful in my role. And I think there's a lot of, ambiguous asks when we go into the workforce, right? Like, you're a customer service representative, so you need to talk to customers. And what does that really mean? What would make me successful in this role versus unsuccessful? And
Yeah.
how can I, leave my day knowing that I did what was required of me in this position. But then I also think that having that ability to see your career progression within the firm and how do I actually achieve that? I would also say that like there's so many consultants and professionals now who specialize in different areas of the world, I guess, for lack of a better word. So, when we talk about housing prices, right, you can have loan officers, real estate agents come in and give presentations on how to actually buy a house and what types of resources exist for a first time home buyer. Or if you're looking
Mhm.
at something like health insurance that can feel really hard and expensive, like there's
Yeah.
so many resources that exist. And sometimes I think I forget that, because I work in this space and I do a lot of networking, so I come across so many different resources in different areas. And I forget that not everybody has access to that. But I mean, imagine
Mhm.
if you're able to provide all of this education. And again, these people will come in and give the education free because that's what they do all day long and they
Yeah.
want to help your employees. But, even if it's access to mental health resources, like there are so many small ways that you can provide your employees access to education, that just makes such a big difference in their life and then makes them in turn more loyal to you as an employer.
You know what I think is so important about what you share there, and I think about it even from, my watching my own son as he's growing and figuring out how to be an adult, is he in particular, and I've noticed a lot of his peers are super independent, really excited to set off in the world. And we probably all were at that age. They don't always know what questions to ask. And so I think what you just described is a really, easy opportunity for for companies to be able to educate and just bring in really valuable resources that maybe we would think, well, we of course there's the dashboard you could go to and find all this stuff, but that's not it. The dots aren't always there when we don't know what we should be asking. And so I think that's a great suggestion. Although like we were talking about before, Gen Z has certainly grown up with technology, much more, your generation than perhaps the generations prior. What do you believe a senior leader can leverage if they're paying attention? Because the idea, like what you said, I totally agree, because you all have a lot more comfort with technology, there's this sense of like, well, that you guys will just figure it out. That's really not fair. And so, what do you believe senior leaders could really do to, leverage more of what you all bring into the workforce?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I personally love AI and I love it for creating that structure. I'm somebody where I have a lot of big ideas, and then sometimes when it comes to actually putting it onto paper, that's a bit more challenging. But AI has this beautiful ability to build out robust training plans or to help you with creating, a performance review and it helps you. I mean, you obviously have to know where to start and how to prompt it, and maybe that looks like working with an HR consultant or with your HR leader, but I truly think it can help you build out that structure if you want to
Mhm.
build a career roadmap for your employees, or a library of resources for them. It has granted us all of this opportunity to spend more time thinking and creating and building, these systems that our new employees can use and existing employees. Again, I think everybody craves structure,
Yeah.
and so few of us, and again, it does take time. Like I recognize that it takes time, it takes, intention. But I really see it as being this ability to spend a lot of time being human with our employees and kind of allowing the system to build all of this structure around it.
Shifting that time into understanding one another and building trust instead of just
Hmm.
the tasks and the to-dos.
Hmm.
So one of the things you said earlier that I want to go back to for a moment is not just your generation, but in that, what you pointed out was that there's a need for structure. There's a need for expectation setting. There's a need for like, what are the boundaries they get to play in? And one of the things I find leaders make a common mistake in is just assuming, well, I hired somebody for this skill set. They have, why can't they just go do their job? And that's just a fallacy across any generation. So when you for a Gen Z that's perhaps interviewing or coming in, what are some of the things you advise them to, to maybe ask about, but to also request, so that it feels like they're expressing that in a way that feels valuable and more in partnership, and maybe help the company see where they could step in, and perhaps avoid that mistake?
Yeah, well, I think that brings up a good point, which is that an interview is a two-way street. I think oftentimes there's kind of this idea that the company is interviewing you, but
Mhm.
as a candidate, you're interviewing that company just as much as, they want to get to know you. And so I really do encourage candidates to, ask what are the key indicators for success in the first 90 days? What kind of roadmap exists? What kind of career progression? What will be the first, check-in? How often will I be able to communicate with my manager? Because I think when you ask those questions in an interview, it really does expose, does this company have something set up? Is that something they value and they've spent enough time to be able to define that? Because it's really hard to make something up on the fly if you don't have something like that
Right.
exists. Or if they do, okay, they are set up. They are equipped to provide me with the resources. If they are not set up for that, I would encourage candidates to go and say, I want frequent check-ins. And you can even come up with your own, template
Yeah.
of like, I want to be evaluated. I think that the vast majority of Gen Z, and quite frankly, every employee, we want to know what we're doing well and we want to know what we can improve. Of course, in a cordial, kind way. That's a lot easier to digest that information than, in a performance improvement plan or something like that. I think it really is about asking those questions early on. And then if they don't exist, challenging your managers or your leaders to be able to provide you that feedback or the training or, a roadmap that shows your ability to progress in your career within an organization.
So I think those are great prompts. I love that you shared those. So you're in your Sound HR business, you're mostly working with small, medium-sized clients. How do leaders respond with working with Gen Z talent, or do you find yourself as being a bit of the Gen Z whisperer for them?
Yes, I do find myself being a little bit of the Gen Z whisperer. And again, I think a lot of it does come down to that structure. I think so often, especially with the clients I work with, but quite frankly, it happens in large organizations as well. Again, I just think there's this miss of we have to set our employees up for success. I think there's kind
Mhm.
of this stereotype that like people should just come in and know exactly how to do what they're doing. And the thing about Gen Z is that we're 20 something year olds, maybe 30 something year olds, but we're all kind of just figuring it out. And it doesn't mean that we're not capable, but we also don't have these years of professional experience and
Mhm.
professional etiquette. And I think for whatever reason, the etiquette that maybe was established 20 or 30 years ago, it's kind of being lost in translation. And so I think really being able to, again, identify what would make somebody successful and how do we set them up for that success is so critical, not just for Gen Z, but for all employees. And that often seems to get missed. The clients I'm working with, typically I'm working with the owner of the firm. And most owners didn't go into business to be people. They went into business because they were really good in their craft and then they grew. And as a byproduct of growth, they needed to find people. It wasn't kind of this strategy that they laid out. So I think it's important to, find partners and consultants who really do specialize in managing people, to
Mhm.
take that initiative because it just makes their lives so much easier in the long run.
I think that's really good advice. So let's talk a little bit about your trajectory from coming out of college, and you've done quite a bit in the 5 years since you've graduated. So you've got Sound HR. You are the president of DisruptHR Las Vegas, which we will make sure people know all about. Super fun.
Mm-hmm.
And you started People and Profits Association. What is that pace tell senior leaders about this generation and how they're relating to careers, and what assumptions about the timeline and paying your dues should they be really sunsetting?
That's a good question. Clearly, I'm not somebody who believes in paying your dues.
I think
I
I think a lot in your generation are.
I think what's been interesting for me about starting Disrupt HR, I bought the license for Disrupt HR Las Vegas a year after I graduated college.
Nice.
I had moved to Vegas. I've been there for 3 months maybe. So I had absolutely no network. I didn't know if I would make it successful. And, I really was blessed to meet, some great individuals who have helped me bring it from the ground all the way up to, a position where people know who we are and are excited about Disrupt HR year after year. And And I think after seeing that success, I got a little bit cocky and I was like, oh, I can do anything I want. I can start my own association, which is the People and Profits Association. I can start my own business, SoundHR. But I think, there's so much value in that excitement and that ambition, right? Coming out of college, wanting to make a name for myself, a career for myself, I knew that nobody was going to give me that platform. So I decided to make that platform for myself. And so I think really encouraging that creativity and that innovation within our young people, there's certainly a lot of things I didn't know. And I could admit to that. And there's certainly a lot of hiccups I've had along the way. And I'm still learning. There's so many things that I have to learn. But I think I really, did realize if you want something and you're willing to put in the work and you surround yourself by the right people, you can accomplish anything. And so I think that as we have, this Gen Z talent come into the workforce, so many of us are like, I know that I can do more than that entry level work.
Yeah.
But you have to have the right mentors in place, the right guidelines, the right parameters, everything like that to be successful. But I mean, watch out, world. If you're willing to give your up and coming talent the ability to be creative and innovative, I mean, the possibilities are endless. And I also think the important thing to realize that we sometimes forget is failure is not a bad thing. I think we're so worried that if we give young people the reins and they don't know exactly what to do, it's going to be the end of the world. But everybody has failed at one point. We've all had those moments, those missteps, and they allow us to grow into our career and to become better professionals. So yeah, I think that there's
those parts. Yeah, we need those.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
between your SoundHR, between DisruptHR and People and Profits, what's the change you're most trying to create across the three, or what's the through line you're trying to create between them all?
I'll tell you a little bit about the People and Profits Association, because I think that really represents, an important thing to me, which is that when you invest in your people, your profits will follow. I think so often HR is labeled as a cost center as opposed to a revenue generator for an employer, which doesn't make sense because HR typically is overseeing the talent acquisition function, which, as we know, if we want to recruit top talent who makes us money, we need a really good recruiting strategy. They oversee the compensation and benefits, which again retains top talent. They're overseeing, retention in other areas. And as we know, turnover is extremely costly. There's compliance, if you get sued, if you have a lawsuit, anything like that, that can be extremely costly. There's all of these things that really add up that we don't think about, because you can't necessarily say, oh, this made us money. I mean, you can if you're looking at the talent acquisition feature, but a lot of it is costing money if you don't have a strategic HR function. And so I created the People and Profits Association to be more than just HR, because so often HR kind of holds all of the people strategy, all of the culture strategy. But at the end of the day, that should be owned by every single person in the organization. The CEO should care about their people just as much as the, finance directors, just as much as operations, sales, marketing. And it's interesting. Every DisruptHR we have, I'll invite friends who are outside of the HR industry, and they'll always say that was really interesting and engaging, even though I'm not an HR professional. And so what I really try to do is say, human strategy, people strategy, it's important, it's relevant to all of us. If you want to have a successful business, you need to have a good people strategy in place. And so whether that's, companies working with me to achieve that, or with other HR consultants, or with their internal HR team, it really is kind of broadening what HR can and should be into a more strategic function.
And what do you, inside that association, what are you hoping that people inside of it gain? What are you trying to provide those who join?
We provide really intentional education that can be, applied to anybody in an organization. So for example, we just had an event where we talked with the C-suite about how impactful their HR team has been for the growth of their business. They went from about 35 employees, I believe 5 or 6 years ago, hired their first HR manager, who's a good friend of mine, and she's absolutely brilliant. And they have grown their team to 140 employees over 6 years. right? And they said, the managing partner and the COO said in that presentation, this would not have been possible without the HR function. Again, not every organization is going to need a dedicated HR team member, but they certainly need some level of HR strategy and people strategy to grow their business. Another example is we have an event coming up on sales in an organization, which is not typically something we would talk about in HR. But again, it comes down to how are you acquiring your sales talent? Mm-hmm. How are you treating your internal staff so that they are more, caring? They're following up with your clients. How are you creating this culture that makes people want to come and buy from your organization? And so I think creating those bigger ideas, those broader ideas than just, we're going to talk about compliance, which of course is important, but I think we kind of have already recycled that in the HR space. We know it's important. So how do we look at the business function as a whole and actually provide meaningful solutions to, a 5-person company or a 500-person company?
I like that the focus of the larger business entity, because I think that's what then builds a different perspective around HR's strategic partnership inside an organization.
Mm-hmm.
Really important. So what's the conversation about Gen Z in business that you wish was happening in senior leadership rooms that just may not be at this point?
I think the biggest thing we're talking about right now, of course, is AI. And we're eliminating the entry-level workforce, which means that, it's just a competitive job market, unfortunately, for everybody, but especially Gen Z. There's kind of this this back and forth of, we won't hire you without experience, but how are you ever supposed to get experience if nobody will hire you? The companies that recognize that AI is a great tool, but it cannot run our companies, are going to be far more successful than the companies who are eliminating their entire workforce. Because at the end of the day, right, we want a good pipeline of leaders and talent for 5, 10, 15 years when we have those management or senior leadership positions come open. And I don't think that enough senior leaders are really considering, what will happen to the future of the company, or, how do you, again, get this talent that's ambitious and has drive and wants to try new things, but might not know everything. But if they're given the right guidelines, they really can, do a lot for the business. So I think investing in those future leaders is important.
And it sounds like in your mind too, Gen Z should be embracing AI as part of that development for themselves. I know my son is he uses it selectively, but he's also still a little cautious of it because he's a creative. So he's doing more photography and things, and he's trying to make sure he thinks about it is keeping his art pure from, other ways of using it. But it seems like this generation still needs to find the best use of AI for what they're trying to apply for and how they can show that they have that capability. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think the wonderful thing about AI is that it allows you to be creative. And what I mean by that is, I know that recently at one of our People and Profits Association meetings, we had a Family Feud style game. And I was able to go into Claude and, analyze all the data. We surveyed 113 people or something like that, and then create the game within Claude. It took me probably 10 or 15 minutes. So I could spend a lot more time coming up with these brilliant ideas, and I don't have to spend, 10, 15 hours like it would have taken me before to create this. And so I think really, AI is not going away. Unfortunately or fortunately, I think at the end of the day, the people who learn to use AI are going to come out on top. And, again, really using it to be creative, to be innovative, is just going to make a world of difference in our careers.
Completely agree. So if every senior leader listening took one thing from this conversation into the next quarter, thinking about how they hire, develop, or really focus on their Gen Z talent, what would you want it to be?
Yeah, I would say be open to listening. I think there's a lot of criticism towards there's been criticism towards every generation. And I think if you actually, stop and listen to what people want, and that goes into your organization of asking for feedback. If you're having high turnover, but you're not asking why people are leaving or why they're staying, right? That's just as important as why people are leaving. You're never really going to solve this revolving door issue. And if you never stop to listen to what Gen Z is saying about wanting purpose in work, wanting work-life balance, there's never going to be an opportunity to improve. And your competitors are going to be the ones who beat you because they're willing to listen. They're willing to make those, changes. And I think that there can be a world where the Gen Z demands also can make a business very profitable. There's been trials of the 4-day work week and businesses saw their revenue increase. I talked about this in my presentation, but employees with creative hobbies outside of work are scoring, up to 30% higher on their performance rankings. So there is a lot of value in having, work-life balance, shorter work periods, more, career progression opportunities and everything like that. But you have to be willing to listen and to adapt.
Absolutely. So where can people find you and learn more about your work and the various things you've talked about today?
Yeah, so I'd say the best way to connect with me is on LinkedIn. My handle is Ashlynne Valdez.
Wonderful. And we'll make sure we put links to your companies, your association, your amazing Disrupt HR talks, so people can see you in action there as well. And Ashlynne, I really enjoyed the conversation. I was excited, with you representing your generation, knowing I have my own personal interest in it with my son. So thank you for taking the time and sharing your thoughts with everybody today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Kim.
For our listeners, we have resources relevant to our conversation today that you can access by visiting couragetoadvancepodcast.com. And remember to like and follow our podcast on your favorite platform so more leaders can benefit from these conversations. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Courage to Advance, where transformative leadership isn't about having all the answers. It's about having the courage to find them.